I'm Adrienne. I'm now Marioles. I've almost been married a year. Um, so I am a former family caregiver to my mom. I started caregiving, I want to say in 2009 at the age of 29, really. I stepped into my caregiver role. My mom was initially diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and then later re-diagnosed with multiple system atrophy. It's a degenerative neurological disease. At the time when my mom was diagnosed with Parkinson's, I was living up in New York City and she was down here in Florida. And everything seemingly was like okay, just in terms of, hearing a Parkinson's diagnosis wasn't like, potentially hearing like a cancer diagnosis. Like I didn't know much about it. She didn't really seem that different. So I was able to still maintain my life in New York City and she was still in Florida. But as the disease started progressing, there were noticeable things that were happening where I would literally just have to like book a one-way flight and fly home to Florida from New York for an unknown amount of time to take care of her because I'm an only child. My parents were divorced. We had no family in Florida. So all of it really fell on me. And in 2015, I finally made the decision that I couldn't caregive at a distance anymore. So after living 10 plus years in New York City, I had to make a super hard decision to kind of let that entire life go and move down to Florida to be closer to my mom and help care for her. So that's a big part of my journey, going from long distance caregiver to, being really close to her. And then after about 4 years, since my mom suffered from a degenerative neurological disease, she did pass away in August of 2020. So now I've kind of almost for the past 3 years been on like a grief journey, so to speak. Like I think, we're all on different journeys and different chapters of our life. I had my caregiving journey. Now it's about the grief journey. Um, but yeah, I mean, caregiving was such a pivotal part of the integral years of my life from like 29 to my mom passed at, I guess, when I was 39. So it really defined who I was. It really played such a major impact in where I was in life compared to my peers. I mean, I'm 42 years old. I just got married a year ago. I don't have kids right now. Like all these life milestones that people my age go through, caregiving kind of put all that on hold. So that's kind of a roundabout synopsis of my care journey. Obviously, there's lots of other layers to it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, you've obviously it was pivotal in your life. You've, made a whole platform now about a young life being interrupted. 29 is a hard time to pick up the life that you're probably just sort of starting to build in
Yeah.
one place and moving home. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit more about that trend? Like, how did you make the decision to move home? What was the transition like from being a long distance caregiver to, being at home, which is transition in and of itself, and now you're
Yeah.
caregiving from up close? What was that like for you?
Definitely. I mean, talk about like experiencing levels of anxiety that I never even knew that I had. When I was living long distance, like I said, with nobody in close proximity to my mom, if I called her and I didn't get her on the phone, it was just like panic instantaneously set in. And I was kind of in this like constant like fight or flight while I was living long distance. And like I said, I mean, fortunately at the time I had a job where they were super flexible. I mean, this was like back in like 2010, 2011, like remote work wasn't even like really a thing like it is now. But fortunately, my employer was like, sure, like you have a computer, just go home, stay home as long as you need to stay there. And it just started getting to the point that I just kept like disrupting my life constantly and living in this constant state of anxiety. Every time I went home, I would just see like more things that as much as I tried to put in place for the short period of time I was there, like we just couldn't do this alone. Um, I even made the transition to move my mom, like, out of living alone into an independent living, community, which worked really well for a while. But even being in this community and hiring caregivers to also come in and help her with like medication management and the activities of daily living, I'm still getting calls like, your mom just passed out. She's in the emergency room. I'm all the way in New York City. So I kind of just came to this turning point where I thought to myself, this isn't fair to my mom. She needs me there. And it's really not being fair to myself because I'm trying so hard to hold on to this life that I had in New York. But it's like conversely, I'm also constantly like stressed, anxious, not knowing like when the next shoe's going to drop, not knowing when I'm all of a sudden going to have to take a one-way flight home. So I just kind of made the decision that it was time. Like, I was not gonna move my mom up to New York. I mean, there was just no way. So, I said to myself, my mom was always there for me through everything. She was a single mom. I mean, she gave up everything she did was for me. And although I knew that I would be stepping into this caregiving role for her one day, like I saw her care for her parents, like most of us imagine, like, I didn't think that was gonna happen until I was, like, in my 50s or my 60s. But I said to myself, "Look, it's happening now, and I don't really have a choice, and God forbid something horrible were to happen and I wasn't there, I don't know how I would be able to live with myself." So, I made the decision to go back to Florida. It was super tough. I mean, New York City, like, I moved there after college. It was, like, this amazing city that helped me, like, identify myself, like, who I am, my personality. I had an amazing group of friends there, and now all of a sudden, I was just gonna have to give all of that up and move back to Florida. And if you would have ever asked me, "Would you ever move back to Florida?" I would have said, "Absolutely not." Um and it was super tough. It was really tough to just leave. I was so worried that I was gonna regret the decision, that I was gonna really have a tough time transitioning. I mean, the one good thing was that in Florida, like, I did have some close friends who used to live in New York, who were from Florida, who had moved back. So, it's not like I was without friends and having to make brand new friends. It was definitely a struggle trying to find a job, and then also balance my caregiving responsibilities as well. And there was definitely a tough transition period, that's for sure. But it also gave me like a huge sense of relief to be so close to my mom. I was able to move her into an assisted living facility because by that time, her disease was progressing even further. And it was just really great for me, as hard as it was, to be able to go every day to be with her, to help her, to just have my eyes on the situation and just have more control over what was going on. Um, but it was tough. It was super, super tough. And I forgot to mention, I had just gotten a dream job opportunity. Like this company, I was working in public relations at the time, like this travel PR company. I had really been like gunning for, finally had an open position, and I had to say no because I had already made the decision that I was going to move. So definitely tough having to give up a life that you're used to and all of a sudden just completely change the course. And also now step in and have to care for somebody other than myself at a young age.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. I mean, I can only imagine how hard that decision would be, especially after, what you just said. You got a dream job and all these
Yeah.
factors that factored into it.
Yeah.
Um, I've heard you talk about sort of feeling like life was on hold,
Mhm.
um, and I don't think that's unique to you. I think a lot of caregivers feel that way, that you're sort of like waiting, for the next thing. Can you talk a little bit about how you managed these feelings? You've moved home, life's kind of on hold, it's a new thing. Can you talk about how you managed the feelings of feeling like life's on hold?
Yeah. I mean, it's super tough when you fall into this role at a young age. And like I know for me, when you're in your when you're in your 20s and 30s, like the only person you have to care about and worry about is you. It's like the time in your life when you can really be selfish and like you're finally making money so you can actually do the things that you want to be able to do. And then it's like all of a sudden that freedom, so to speak, is ripped away from you. Like for me, I was a huge traveler. Like, I was going backpacking for, like, months at a time and, doing all of these things, and now all of a sudden, it's just like, wow, all of these things that I used to do that I loved doing, I can't do them anymore. Everything it's I kind of call it, like, pushing pause on my life because it seems like I'm just kind in this holding pattern and everybody is just, like, rushing by and hitting life milestones. I'm not gonna lie and say that it wasn't hard. I mean, it's like here I am, like, caring for my mom and doing all of these things, like changing her diapers and feeding her and bathing her, all of these, like, non-sexy things, right? And conversely, I'm watching my friends, like, meeting guys, getting married, buying their first house, starting to have kids, and it's so hard to see people, like, able to continue on in their lives and not have to just deal with this holding pattern, and, I mean, I'm not gonna lie and say that I those days, it was really tough to hold on to the hope that things were going to change one day, that, like, this was not my forever. My mom had a neurodegenerative disease. Like, maybe she would live for another 2 years, maybe she would live for another 10 years, but this was only like a small piece of my story. And I had to just hold on to this hope, or else I feel like I would have just spiraled into, like, complete darkness and despair. Like, I had to hold on to hope that just because my life was not falling into place in this timeline, like, I don't know why we as humans kind of set these timelines for ourselves. Like, okay, by this age, I'm going to be this, and by this age, and by this age. And I had to just at some point say, screw the timeline, throw it out the window, because it was only causing me more stress and anxiety with every year that I wasn't hitting these, like, certain milestones that I only set for myself, right? And potentially society has these expectations that things should be done by a certain age. So I told myself I just have to let it go and that everything happens for a reason. And when the timing is right, kind of all of these things will start falling into place for me as well. So it was definitely a big mindset shift, definitely tough to keep top of mind, especially in the hardest days of caregiving. But mindset is just so important in all aspects of life, but specifically as a caregiver going through your care journey.
Yeah, and I mean, you've now, like, talked to so many caregivers and obviously spend your time in this space. Do you have any,
Yeah.
like, tips, I guess, or, like, advice for how to sort of mentally let go of this timeline or how to, I guess letting go of the timeline has to do with holding on to hope a little bit. You just
Right.
sort of connect those 2 things. Are there any, like, practical tips for how someone else who is, like, can't shake this, like, isn't ready to move there yet, how can they do that?
I mean, it's a process. Like, it took me a really long time. I think, especially when you fall into caregiving at a young age, denial is is a huge piece of this. It's the denial. It's like the constant, like, self pity. I know at least it was for me. It's like, why me? Like, why is this happening to me? Like, what have I done in this lifetime? It was very self serving and selfish, right? Like, I was just thinking, like, me, and I wasn't even thinking about, like, my mom and, like, oh my gosh, like, this is actually happening to her. So it's like I'm being super selfish of, like, why me? Why now? Why this? I don't want to do this, but I have to do this. I think it's just learning to accept the role that you've fallen into. And that's super tough. I'm not going to say that it's easy, but I think the quicker you're able to accept and acknowledge yourself, like, okay, now I have this new identity and this identity is caregiver. Like, it does not define my entire identity, but it is a big piece of my identity. And I personally, the second that I learned to accept and identify as a caregiver, which in turn then caused me to start looking into support groups or trying to find more resources to support myself, I felt like that was a huge game changer in kind of holding on to hope too. Because then I was starting to see that there were other young caregivers out there, like, which I couldn't even believe because, like, Facebook groups weren't really a thing back then, and I didn't know anybody that had gone through this, but I feel like once I started seeing other people and hearing about their journeys, it was so validating, and I feel like that caused me to hold on to hope as well. Because then it was like, okay, I'm not the only one going through this. There are people that I can turn to and lean on for support. So I would really say, like, trying to let go of the why is this all happening to me kind of mindset, embracing this new role as a caregiver, and then using that to find the support that you really need as a young caregiver going through this journey.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think the acceptance piece is kind of hard. For myself, I took care of my dad and I felt for a while like, but I'm the kid. Like why, like I
Yeah,
couldn't let
totally.
go of this. And I think accepting like the relationship change or the role reversal really changed it for me also to sort of let go of the timeline and let go of like
Yeah.
these expectations that we set for ourselves. Um your mom passed a couple years ago. You mentioned you're
Yeah.
going through your own grief journey now. You also mentioned you got married. Some
Yeah.
exciting things are happening. What has life been like, post caregiving? What's this experience been?
Yeah. I think when you care for someone with a degenerative disease, you're already preparing yourself for the fact that like there's no cure for this. Like they're never going to get better. They're only going to get worse. And it's interesting because it wasn't until after my mom passed away that I learned about this term anticipatory grief, which is basically like the anticipation of what is to come. And that, like, really hit me hard because I feel like over the course of, like, my 10-year care journey, it was like these peaks and valleys. It's like anticipatory grief, and then everything was okay, and then anticipatory grief every time my mom progressed to, like, the next stage. So, it's really interesting because I thought when my mom passed away, like, I would just be like, like you see in the movies, like, on the floor, you wouldn't be able to get me up, I wouldn't get out of bed for, like, weeks upon weeks. And it was very strange because, like, that wasn't the case, and I feel like, in part, it was because over the course of 10 years, my mind, my subconscious was preparing me for this. Um, it was really, really weird, to lose my mom even though I knew it was coming. It did happen pretty quickly, and unexpectedly, how quickly she passed, but, it definitely took some time, but I have to say, like, after my mom passed, it was like she passed in August. Then my boyfriend, my husband now, we, like, moved in together. We started a boat business together. Then the January after she passed, like, he proposed, and then we got married, and so many things started happening, and I'm very spiritual, and I truly felt like, "Okay, this is mom." It's kind of her saying, like, I know that all of these things, big things are about to happen in your life. So like I'm gonna step back, like you've served me, and now I'm gonna like let you live your life. Um, it's been interesting because it's like people say, well, what am I gonna do with all this time when I'm not a caregiver anymore? Or trust me, you will find ways to fill it. Um, yeah, there's been so much, of course, so many things that have happened that I wish my mom were there, my wedding, certain life milestones that I've gone through. But um, it's also been an interesting journey because it's allowed me to do a lot of reflection. And I always say this to like other young caregivers or on my podcast. It's like, I know that I'm telling you these things, but you're in it, so you can't see it. Like the why is this happening to me? But it's like now that I'm almost 3 years out, like I'm seeing at least for my own personal care journey, why I believe this happened to me. And that's being able to take my journey and help others. I've been able to expand Young Life Interrupted platform ever since my mom passed away. Actually, to honor the first anniversary of her passing, is when I released the first episode of my podcast. And just doing other things in the caregiving space is like how I feel like I can honor my mom, um, and her legacy, and just the incredible mom that she was for me. So it's just crazy also how fast time flies. Like, I can't even believe it's gonna be 3 years since she's gone. Um, so
Yeah, I got the chills when you said your mom sort of like, moved out of the way so other things could happen. And
yeah,
and I understand missing her because she's missing milestones, but
yeah.
I think that's really beautiful sort of way to look at it. Also, you mentioned anticipatory grief, and I don't have the calendar in front of me, but I think an episode or 2 ahead of this one, we're talking to a therapist about anticipatory grief. So, people can go listen to that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Um,
I highly recommend that people listen to that episode because that was huge for me when I understood, like, okay, so this is what all of those feelings and emotions are and are. It just gave so much more understanding to so much that I was going through over the course of my care journey. So that's a super important episode.
um, Shifting gears a little bit, our a lot of our focus here is on the cost of caring and some of the hidden
Yeah.
costs. Um, I would love to ask, how were you and your mom funding her care? What did that look like for you? Obviously, you had, moved home and changed jobs, but
Yeah.
income was coming from her. Just sort of what
Yeah.
was that whole picture like?
I always say that, I mean, my mom did a lot of things right. And one of them was, when she was still working before her diagnosis, she started paying into a long term care insurance plan for herself. And let me tell you that that made all of the difference. It's like caregivers face so many different strains, like whether it's physical, emotional, mental, but also the financial strain of caregiving. And I have to say that in our circumstance, which I know is very unique, we didn't have that financial strain because my mom had a long-term care insurance policy, which at the time she started paying into it, she had an unlimited policy. So, for people who don't, I knew nothing about long-term care insurance when I fell into caregiving. I had so much to learn, but it's basically an unlimited policy doesn't even exist today. But basically, from the age that she needed to start using the long-term care, it would last her until the day she died. I mean, God forbid if she was like 55 and needed to start opting into it, she could have it from 55 if she would have lived till 105, 50 years. So when we needed to start moving her into more long-term care living, um, the long-term care insurance paid for that. I mean, when my mom moved into assisted living, it was like, I want to say over $6,000 a month. And that was just for the assisted living. That's not even like her medications and supplies and all of those things. So the long-term care insurance plan, and then my mom had her Social Security and her pension. So that money was able to cover the cost of, like I said, like medications and supplies. Um, Even though my mom lived in an assisted living, because she had such advanced needs, we had to have a caregiver with her 24 hours a day. So I was able to hire two caregivers using my mom's money to be there during the day so that I could get some work done, and then I would be her caregiver from afternoon until evening. But I mean, I always say it would have been a totally different situation for us had she not had long-term care. I mean, we would have had to live together, which is the case for so many people. Like, I know a lot of people choose to live at home with their caree, but I think a lot of people wish that they did have the means to be able to provide them, the choice of going into a long-term care facility or even hire caregivers. So we were super, super fortunate. And, my mom made really smart financial decisions her entire life. So even after her passing, like she wasn't in all of this debt. It didn't have all these repercussions that like fell back on me. So I always say, thank you, mom, for at least setting yourself up in a good financial position um, to allow for this part of caregiving to be a lot easier.
Do you know how she knew to pay into a long-term insurance policy? Not It's not hidden information, but I would
Yeah.
say our parents' generation and even our generation doesn't it's not talked about a lot. So do you know how
Yeah.
she knew to do this?
So she had a financial advisor, and it was her financial advisor who recommended to her. I don't even remember what age. I mean, it was definitely later in life. But he's the one that recommended, like, you really should start paying into this. Like, whatever happens to you in the future, like Adrienne will be, not have to worry about taking, the cost of care. So I think for her, it was just a no-brainer to put that in place and start paying into it. And it did. I mean, it really relieved me of that financial strain, which I know so many people experience as a caregiver.
Yeah, and then I guess sort of looking ahead, is that something that you're paying into now? And I guess I'm wondering, you guys were in what sounds like a pretty lucky situation
Yeah.
financially.
Mhm.
But in what ways, has caregiving or did caregiving impact, your thoughts around spending and saving and just future planning in general?
Yeah. Um, so I actually have the same financial advisor as my mom did. And, he's like, Adrienne, you got to get these things put in place, just like, look at the situation with your mom. And so I have not started paying into a long-term care policy yet, but it's definitely something that I plan on doing. I think if anyone has the means to be able to do that, it's such a smart decision. Um, in terms of saving, for future cost of care, I mean, I would say my mom taught me very well, like, the importance of, being financially responsible. So I feel like even to this day, I'm super financially responsible. I can't say I have, like, a little, like, nest egg of, you know, if something happens to me in the future, but it's definitely more top of mind because of what happened with my mom. And like I have a stepdaughter and if I do have like a child one day, and my husband, like I wouldn't want to put them in this financial strain, if something were to happen to me down the road. So I think it does make it more top of mind for you. Um and this is actually a good reminder that I do need to take action on it and at least start getting the steps in motion.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I think so many caregivers are thinking about our own future care, but I think
Yeah.
unless you've been through a caregiving experience, you might not think about that. It's something I think about often for other people is like, how do we get people to care about their future, not future planning. I think people are planning for retirement, but for
Yeah.
unexpected things, like
Mhm.
if I need care sooner or when I need care,
Right.
how do we get people to care before
Yeah.
it's a crisis?
100%. And that's part of the toughest part is like you don't want to think. Like nobody wants to think about that. But it's like we have to start having these conversations and putting the paperwork in place and putting all the things in place because it's really service to like your family if you don't at least attempt to put something in place, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. You mentioned you had a couple, like your mom had a couple moving pieces. She had savings, she had this
Yeah.
insurance policy. Um, you were working and managing your own money. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about your like systems for managing
Yeah.
care expenses? What was working well? What didn't work well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think so the finances when my mom started showing signs that like I needed to start stepping in more. And this was like at the very beginning, even when she was living on her own. The finances were the first thing I decided to take a hold of. And that was just like figuring out, okay, like what are all of your accounts? Like where's the money? And then you have, these retirement savings and you have this long-term care insurance and you have this life insurance policy, like all of these things. Like let me wrap my head around all of it. And, back when I started caregiving, um, like 2009-ish, I don't it's just so different today, like, there weren't all of these apps or all of these programs, right, to help you specifically manage finances as it relates to caregiving. So, I mean, I just use, like, a handy old Excel spreadsheet, where I would just list all of the things and input monthly expenses and cross-check against, like, income coming in. So I really just tracked it in just an Excel spreadsheet. So that was how I felt like I was best able to manage, her different expenses, and then also to assess, like, okay, like, I don't know, this insurance seems kinda high, like, do we call? Do we see if we can get the cost down? Like, what is this thing that she pays for every month that she probably doesn't even know that she's paying for? Um, so yeah, like, it wasn't like, the hardest part was just figuring out, like, where are all the things, how do I get access to them? I think another important thing when you start thinking in terms of like financial planning for your loved one is for them to start getting your name on all of the accounts if they choose to do that, right? If they trust you with being on their accounts. Like that was one of the first steps that we had to take, because it was like, okay, if I'm going to start managing all this stuff, then I have to get my name on all of it, like bank accounts, long-term care insurance policies, all the things. And as many caregivers who are listening to this know, like if your name is not on things, like there is like a steel wall, like you will not get through. So I think once I was able to just tap into all of it, it really wasn't too bad. My mom didn't have like exorbitant spending. So it really wasn't super tough to manage once I kind of got everything just filtered into this spreadsheet, compiled, tabbed. Um, it was a lot easier for me to manage.
And was that something that your mom was open to, like, when you started putting your name she started putting your name
Yeah.
on her accounts and stuff? Was that, like obviously, that was early. Was
Yeah.
that something she was open to, or was this, like, a hard
No, it's interesting. I have to say another thing about my mom, because I hear from so many caregivers in general, young caregivers, any caregiver. My mom was like really easy, like when it was like, okay, mom, I'm gonna start taking over the bills. Of course she'd be like, no, 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 I don't want you to like, no, I don't want to bother you with that. But I was like, no, 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 this is what I'm gonna do. And it was kind of like that transition from like that full circle that kind of happens when you caregive to like you as the young child stepping into like more of this like parental role. Um, she never had pushback. And I hear from so many people that the pushback on so many things makes it so much harder, which I can only imagine that it would. So no, I think she was like, let's get you on the accounts. And then I think I have a lot to owe to our financial planner, because he was like, Adrienne's got to get on all these accounts, because the day that you pass, if she's not on all these accounts, it's just going to make things so much harder after the fact, too. So, no, I was like, okay, this is what we're going to do. She just kind of went along with it. I guess my mom, like, definitely had a more passive personality. Like, she was definitely more kind of go with the flow, non confrontational type person. So fortunately, no, it was super easy to convince her that, XYZ needed to happen.
Yeah, that's awesome, and I think we maybe need to get your financial advisor's phone number for everyone. It sounds like he
Yeah,
was, like,
right? Oh,
such a guiding light for you guys.
definitely. Yeah, it made it a lot easier. It's like it's hard enough after your loved one passes with all of the things that you have to arrange. But, because my name was on all the accounts and, the beneficiary, it was just a much easier process, at least when it came to like closing out accounts and all of that, to not have to worry about this massive stress that I know that so many people go through because their parents or their loved one don't have all of these things in order earlier.
Is there anything you would have done just differently looking back around, like, I guess any of the finances, insurance, like, in retrospect, is there anything you wish you'd done sooner or differently?
I think one thing that I always put off, and something that I'm very cognizant about, like just in my own finances, like, I've been with my, I don't know, cell phone company for like 12 years, right? And then it's just all of a sudden every month it just auto renews, auto renews, auto renews. Um, Sometimes I'm good at taking a look at everything and saying, okay, wait a minute, like this bill is like increasing. Like, let me pick up the phone, let me call the company, let me see if I'm able to get like a better price on my cell phone bill. That's just something I do naturally in my own life. So I think if anything, it was like looking at some of these things that my mom had put in place, like her Medicare and certain things. And it was just like, all right, well, we're paying this much a month for this. And I always thought to myself, maybe I should call. Maybe I should see if there's like a better plan, where we could pay a little bit less money, but she could still get the same cost of care. There were different things like that that I wish that I had just done, as just kind of like, well, if we can save a little bit here and save a little bit here, then this money can now go to this. But in caregiving and knowing the headaches that just calling insurance companies, like any sort of provider causes, I was just like, I don't have the time. I don't have the headspace. Like, if she can afford it, let's just stick with what she has. But if I could do it all over again, I think I would have been more on top of and aware of, how can we continually look for cost savings? Like, whether it's through, even just medications, like going from just filling her prescriptions at CVS to moving to like a mail order prescription service. And we ended up saving a decent amount of money on her many, many prescriptions because I thought to myself, there's got to be a better way. There's probably a better price. So yeah, I would just say like maybe taking the reins on more of that. Um, but I think other than that, I feel very content with how I was able to manage all her finances. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Also, I totally hear you on, when you're in the thick of it, like the emotional bandwidth even to like
Oh,
not yell at an insurance person
oh
is
my
like
gosh. 100%. It's just such a process. It's unfortunate that so many of those things are just such a process, and I feel like that holds a lot of people back too, because it's like
totally.
either it's like, "Okay, how long am I gonna be on hold? Am I gonna get hung up on? Are they gonna transfer me to 5 different people? Now when we talk about this, how long is it gonna take to go into effect? How many more times am I gonna have to call back?" Like, we
Right.
all know the same story. It's just unfortunately the way that it is. So,
Yeah. Um, I guess, now you're sort of on the other side of caregiving.
yeah,
What we like just to round out our conversation, we like to ask
sure.
everyone, what do you know now that you wish you knew at the beginning of your caregiving journey?
Whew, so much. Um, Gosh, so much. I think, I think one of the biggest things, I touched on earlier is like the mindset piece of caregiving. I think that's so important. What I know now is that there's a saying like what's meant for you will not pass you. And I think when you're in the thick of it, you're just like, how the heck is like caregiving and doing all of these things meant for me? I think looking back now, especially kind of in my specific situation and where I am in now finding this passion in wanting to help other young caregivers who are hopeless and who don't have support, help them to kind of be supported through their whole care journey. I feel like all of this happening to me at a young age happened so that now I could develop this platform and be where I am today. Um, I think another huge piece of it is learning to be present in your care journey. Um, as a caregiver, and I feel just like in anything in life, it's like we're always thinking about like the next thing, right? Like as we go throughout our day, it's like we're never really present in the moment. We're just thinking about, okay, and then I have to be at the gym, and then it's like dinner, and then I'm going out, with friends. We're always thinking of that next thing. And I think a huge piece of advice, like looking back, I wish I would have been more present with my mom instead of always thinking about what do we have to do next? Just like being with her in that time, like giving her my undivided attention when I could, and just trying to enjoy and cherish the time that we had together, even though it looked super different than anything I ever thought it would look like in a million years. But really just embracing the person that they are, like letting go of the person that they were, because that was really hard for me. I kept holding on to like who my mom was. And I eventually just had to let go of that and just embrace the person that she was now and learn new ways to bond with her and things that I could do with her. They were very limited, but being present and just really taking it in because when they're gone, like that's it. And as hard as your care journey might have been, and as many times as you had wished it was over, because I know for me, like so many times during my journey, like selfishly, and for my mom, because I saw her suffering, I was like, can this just be over? Like for both of us. Um, but when it's over, it's over. And I think now in hindsight, I miss it. Like never in a million years would I have ever said, like, I miss caregiving. I miss caring for my mom. But like I do. And I think a lot of times, like what I wouldn't give, right? To have her back, even having to be in that role. Um, so yeah, those are kind of my post caregiving words of wisdom if I could kind of go back and do it all again.
Yeah, I love it. I was talking to a caregiver yesterday who cares for her mom with dementia, and she was saying,
Yeah.
her mom used to tell this story that was like not based in reality, but it was a story she used to tell and tell, and she was like, "This isn't a real story. This is annoying." But now her mom doesn't tell
Yeah.
that story anymore, and she's like, "I miss the story that she used to tell."
Yeah.
Um, And so, yeah, like, as much as in the moment you're like, "Ugh, this will never end,"
Yes.
it once it ends, it ends. So,
Yeah.
I really love that. You've obviously built an awesome platform for other young caregivers or all caregivers. Can you tell us a little bit about A Young Life Interrupted and where
Yeah.
people can find you online if they're interested?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the whole Instagram, it's evolved over the years, but I started it back in 2019, honestly, just as a way to document just my day-to-day caregiving experiences, like never in a million years thinking like, oh, people would actually follow my Instagram or people might actually find my content validating or interesting. So over the years it's kind of evolved and now it's Young Life Interrupted. So I'm on Instagram and Facebook. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I always had this idea in the back of my head that I wanted to do a podcast. But when my mom was alive, it was just with everything else going on, it was just too much. So after she passed away and I stepped out of caregiving for a bit, when I stepped back in, I was like, I'm going to do this podcast, but it's going to be a podcast specifically dedicated to young caregivers because we are such like a subset of like the larger caregiving population. And while there are so many themes that spread across all different types of caregivers, caregiving at a young age comes with its own unique challenges. So I started a podcast that speaks specifically to um, what I went through in my journey as a young caregiver, bringing on other young caregivers to talk about their journeys and experts in like different caregiving fields. And I also had a private Facebook group for young caregivers, Young Life Interrupted, for people to find community and support. Because when I was in my care journey, finding a Facebook group of young caregivers was just like, oh my gosh, like a weight lifted off of my shoulder to have this community of people that I could turn to and who actually understood what I was going through. So, yeah, I'm super excited for the continued evolution, and just hope to help reach and serve other young caregivers throughout their journeys.